and good evening. I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad Kuttan.
Welcome to Consider This, the show where we want you to consider what you know of the news of the day. Now, let's begin the show with some good news. At the daily briefing today, Health Ministry Director General Dr. Nur Hisham Abdullah reported that Malaysia recorded 85 new COVID-19 cases today. Now, it's worth noting that this is the first time in a month that the daily cases have been below 100. Also announced today was the cancellation of the UPSR and PT3 exams. SPM and STPM exams, however, will be postponed to the first quarter of 2021. And for parents who may be concerned about schools reopening, the Education Ministry has said it will announce 2 weeks in advance any decision to reopen schools. But whatever that it will be, schooling will very likely be different from what it was before. Wouldn't it be, Sharad?
Well, you know, and I think the Minister was trying to point out these realities. And in his address, he does, in fact, note that there are a lot of uncertainties still out there and along the way. But what the government seems to be well aware of is that they're going to be trying to enable a return to some sort of normality. Now, the postponement of exams, the cancellation of exams this year, and as you mentioned earlier, Melissa, I think perhaps will come with some relief to not just the children who maybe don't want to take those exams, but of course their parents, and as well as teachers and the schools themselves who would have otherwise had to prepare for these exams.
Exactly right. Now, in other news, Defence Minister Ismail Sabri Yaakob said 13 prison academies nationwide will be used as detention centres for violators of the MCO. If you recall, yesterday, Ismail Sabri announced that police will no longer be issuing compounds and instead revert to court sentencing. MCO violators were previously jailed, but the prisons department had complained that this had led to overcrowding and could create new COVID-19 outbreaks. So I truly wonder if this new solution to gazette these prison academies as detention centres will lead to the same problem of, not being able to observe social distancing.
Melissa, it does seem like the government is in a bind, right? I mean, the idea of the MCO buying time for government to set up the medical services, not be overwhelmed by a spike in infection rates, but also, just to get everybody used to new ways of dealing with social life until a vaccine is found. Right. Now, all that, the spirit of the MCO was in that, I think, space. The punishment thing, as a form of deterrence, I get it, but, I think people will be concerned
whether... Is it a deterrent, though, Sharad? I don't know. I mean, the police had admitted a 1,000 ringgit fine, a 1,000 ringgit compound. They said they didn't see that as a deterrent. I wonder whether this would be considered a deterrent. Perhaps we're missing the point. Perhaps the idea is to honour the spirit of the MCO and find out why people are flouting the MCO. Is it ignorance? Is it irresponsibility, or is it poverty? Is it essential, trips that you have to do? Not everyone is out there just because they're bored. Yeah,
and of course we're also finding in the news, as we did when there was lockdown in Wuhan, some people fall through the net, and some really tragic cases. We had that story of that old man who had been starving until police officers found him, and he's since found dead as well. And so really tragic cases. So the system's not perfect, and it was put together, in order to respond to a dire need. Right. So I think on one hand, there might be a lot of us who are sympathetic with the government's, the immense pressure on government to deliver. What is the measure of the MCO success? It's not compliance with the MCO. Right. It is, in fact, in the changing nature of the infection rates and so on and so forth.
The flattening of the curve.
The flattening of the curve. I mean, that really would be the objective.
Yes.
Right? So, okay.
I agree.
And Melissa, you point to a very important thing. The devil is in the detail when it comes to this shift from fines to imprisonment. Will those new centres, in fact, create the same problems that ordinary or regular prisons would have been for those trying to put this together.
In fact, we had a conversation with lawyer Sharizan Johan last week, and he suggested rather than, he suggested delaying sentencing for one thing, but rather than imprisonment, to perhaps give community service, because the spirit of the MCO is about, if you can contravene the MCO, you are doing a disservice to the community, and perhaps the fine or the punishment should be more service to the community done at a later date. Some things to consider.
And also, you know, Melissa, we don't know when the MCO is going to end, and are the sentences going to run beyond the MCO period? And what about the fact that, because many of the people who are out there presumably are heads of homes, households, are they going to be all in prison?
Oh,
I mean, and what is going to be the consequence of imprisoning the head of the household during this period? It is quite bewildering to think that this is going to be an adequate solution.
That's right. Okay, well, now let's very quickly take a look at non-COVID news. My Events International founder, Shahrul Hamid Dawood, has reportedly been appointed the new CEO of HRDF, or the Human Resource Development Fund. Now, according to Malaysia Kini, his appointment will first have to be announced officially by the new HRDF board. However, Penang Deputy Chief Minister P. Ramasamy has already to Shahrul was due to him being the principal organizer of a series of events in 2016 that featured Zakir Naik.
Yes, and you know, equally fascinating, not just the criticisms, Melissa, but also those who have, the minister who's come out to defend his appointment, talking about the fact that the man in question, his grandfather was a founder member of MIC. And it's fascinating when politicians think out loud, what they're actually thinking is, you know, is a source of I think, a lot of analysis. That one of the things, it seems to be like his political genealogy seems to trump any question about his professionalism. I'm not quite sure why the minister thought that this would be the winning argument.
That's up to the minister to respond then. Okay, we're going to take a quick break. After this, how higher education must change to adapt to the current pandemic and also the anticipated recession. Stay tuned. Hello, if you've just joined us, you're watching Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris, with me, Sharad Kutan. The COVID-19 pandemic is set to change the higher education landscape, both locally and globally. Institutions of higher learning that were perhaps in distress before the pandemic may not survive the added financial and enrollment pressures, and even the strongest of universities are likely to see transformative changes. How will these changes impact students, faculty, admin staff and alumni? Joining us on the line now to explore this further is Najmie Noordin, Chief Operating Officer of Cosmo Point Sdn Bhd. Najmie, good evening. Thank you for joining us on the show tonight.
Good evening, Melissa.
Now, there are, as I understand it, 20 public higher education institutions in Malaysia and 447 privately owned ones. Najmie, are we likely to see this number shrink, either through consolidation or through closures of those without the financial wherewithal to survive the pandemic? What do you think?
The short answer is very likely. The long answer would be, it is a long-standing issue since the early 2010s, where we have a problem of overcapacity and a flattish growth in the number of students. It is likely that consolidation was supposed to happen in the next few years. That's already been discussed at the Ministry of Higher Education level in previous years, but it will be accelerated due to this pandemic.
So, from your point of view, is this a welcome moment for change within the industry, for rationalization, or do you see some downsides to something like the pandemic pushing for these changes?
I think first, this is not a situation that is good for anyone, regardless of whether there needs to be a consolidation. You want the consolidation to happen through a more structured process rather than forced in this manner. Because we are talking about 700,000 students in the private higher education institutions, more than 23,000 academicians, and thousands more of support staff. So if we were to say that this is a good thing, then it is a bit disrespectful, I think, for them and also for the students. But in the long term, I think a lot of the players themselves admit that we have too many universities and colleges in Malaysia.
Right. Najmie, can we talk about the specific challenges that institutions of higher learning are facing because of this pandemic? Now, I'm wondering whether universities and university colleges have the autonomy and the flexibility in coming up with practical solutions in dealing with some of these challenges.
Alhamdulillah, I think both the Ministry of Higher Education and the Malaysian Qualifying Agency, MQA, has been quite open to the idea of us delivering the content, the teaching and learning in various methods. I guess it is up to the institutions themselves whether they have the nimbleness and the flexibility to change their methods. For us, for example, because we have campuses all around Malaysia, therefore the challenges for each of these locations are very, very different in terms of the access to online materials, etc. So we have the flexibility. It is whether or not the institutions themselves are flexible enough to adapt to this current situation.
Right. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about the issues with online learning. I mean, there's so many, right, for students, for faculty, but most institutions are kind of built for physical teaching and physical learning. Even the online learning is structured to have some kind of FaceTime, one-on-one FaceTime. And for faculty, I'm sure many of them have to actually go to the campus to conduct their courses and their classes. So how can universities and institutions of higher learning adapt to this if they are infrastructurally built for physical learning?
I guess that's the big challenge right now. How do we deliver the teaching and learning in a way that the students themselves feel engaged and which the lecturers or the academicians themselves are committed to? And it's true, Melissa, that a lot of, even for my institutions, I mean the institutions under our management, it is totally built for face-to-face teaching and learning. But I think the adoption of technology forced by the pandemic has so far been quite acceptable by a lot of the students. Obviously, it's not ideal. There are various issues. For example, I think internet connectivity is a huge, huge problem. So every time people say go online, there's a big difference between having access to internet and having access to quality streaming connectivity. And a lot of the lectures, if you were to do streaming via Zoom or Google Classroom, a lot of the areas in Malaysia are still not at the level, the infrastructure is still not at the level where students can access. And most of them, for us especially, the B40 segment, they may not even have laptops, so it's purely a mobile experience for them. So we have adapted, we've used a lot of the other infrastructures, even up to WhatsApp, to deliver some of our content. And
can I interrupt you right there? You penned a piece, opinion piece recently about the challenges faced that are going to be faced by the institutions of higher learning, and you flagged the oncoming recession and the question of employability of kids now invested in these education in these courses, and you had a proposal. Could you tell us what that proposal was?
Yeah, I think. Previously, there's a lot of discussion on graduate employability. A lot of effort has been put into change the curriculum, but it takes time. Now that the pandemic has come and we are foreseeing a recession, there must be an idea of a jobs guarantee program where the government absorb excess capacity in the marketplace and place them in projects or initiatives to keep them employed. I give a good example, like, we still need a lot of teachers, especially now with the shortening of the academic year at rural areas. Could some of these graduates who are not trained as teachers, of course, but can they perform a function of tutors to go into the rural areas, paid for by the government, to deliver teaching and learning, to guide the B40 segment out of their current problems?
Okay. Well, perhaps that's for something to consider to deal with the effects of the expected recession. But Najmie, what do you think the Ministry of Higher Education should be prioritizing now?
There's a lot of issues, I think, with adapting to a new ministry, because people forget that in the previous administration, it was just one ministry, Ministry of Education. And just as recently as February, it became a Ministry of Higher Education again. So there's a whole lot of adaptation in terms of the kind of structure that you put in place to deliver the best result. For me, the first thing is the safety and health of our students and staff. there needs to be a clear SOP, not just for now, but post the MCO period. Secondly, the current teaching and learning gaps and future teaching and learning gaps because of the things that they missed during these few months of MCO. And third, obviously, is the sustainability of the institutions themselves. You know, you mentioned about 447 institutions, private. A lot of them are, the balance sheet is stretched already at the moment. We can let them die, which is fair enough, but certain institutions are actually delivering quality education, and perhaps a certain kind of economic package should be given and granted to these institutions.
Najmie, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight. Appreciate your time as well as your insights. Now we're going to take a quick break, but after this, more on how institutions of higher learning are adapting to the COVID-19 pandemic. Stay tuned to consider this. For staying with Sharad and I on Consider This. Now, with universities across the country closed, a looming global recession and uncertainties over COVID-19's trajectory, is it enough for higher education to move their learning online? Joining us on the line now, we have Dr. Thomas Barker, Associate Professor and Head of the School of Media, Languages and Cultures at University of Nottingham, Malaysia. Good evening, Thomas. Thank you for coming on the show tonight. Now, if I could begin with getting your thoughts on what are some of the conversations that are currently being had globally about the challenges that this pandemic is posing for universities and institutions of higher learning?
Well, thanks so much for the invitation, Sharad and Melissa, to be here tonight. Yeah, look, the higher education industry or sector is, like every other industry and sector at the moment, is really going through a challenging time. Higher education is also highly globalized, with lots of staff and students moving across the world. So the restrictions on travel and the problems around moving even have become real issues at the moment and also going forward. And you see these debates emerging in countries like Australia and the UK about the sustainability of some of their campuses and universities with the reduction or potential reduction in international students over the next 6 to 12 to 18 months. If you look at the Sydney Morning Herald from today, UNSW has just announced that it may lose about $600 million, and it's asking staff to take a pay cut and to do things like this to help the university financially. So there's some real struggles for some universities and some countries that really rely on international students for their viability.
Thomas, is this a direct result of the pandemic and concerns about being infected or countries where infection rates are high? Or is it to do with the recession and perhaps a lack of confidence in spending money in higher education? What's the source of the potential downsides of this particular crisis?
Well, I think it's a projection. I think lots of universities, some in Australia, such as UNSW, Monash, and others, have really high international student numbers, and they make up a bulk or a real substantial part of the income of universities as the universities have shifted to fees as their source of income and the reduction in state funding. So I think it's partly students not turning up for semester. In Australia, semesters, at least in Queensland, where I'm from, they used to start in March. So maybe students aren't turning up, students are requesting refunds, and then also looking at enrollments for the next semester after. That would be also where the problems are.
Right. Thomas, do you think that with younger people, with university students, they would be the first to likely bounce back psychologically from this crisis and be more open to traveling and living abroad and perhaps studying abroad? Yeah,
I mean, I'm no longer young, so maybe I can't speak on their behalf, but I think, it really feels like this generation, at our students' age, have it really tough. They've just come out of the 2008 recession. I was a PhD student during that period, and I came out into a job market that was pretty lackluster, and that hasn't really picked up, at least in higher education. And these students are similarly going to come out of graduate in the next few years into very uncertain times as well. And I think, but I think the students are also having a real struggle at the moment too, as they struggle to adapt to being locked down or being stuck in their houses, not being able to see their friends, trying to adapt to online learning. So yeah, students. I mean, on the optimistic side, students may come out of this and graduate much more resilient and much more able to adapt to really difficult circumstances. Yeah, that's the optimistic side, I guess. But they may come into an economy where there's a recession and there are very few jobs, and that will be really difficult.
Thomas, could you tell us how Nottingham University, Malaysia in particular, I mean, the problems that you've had for this period, the MCO period, and what do you anticipate? How are you and your university dealing with these problems?
Well, like all campuses, it came very, very suddenly. I think we started a week teaching, and then I think by the Tuesday we had received instructions that the country was basically going into lockdown, and not lockdown but RMO, and we would no longer be allowed on campus, and that classes would be stopping, and there was a lot of confusion, and people were becoming quite, I guess, quite panicked. People didn't really know how close the virus was, whether they could move. We had students go home, both to their houses or their residence in Malaysia, but also overseas. Yeah, and it was like 2 weeks of a lot of confusion. And then I think it wasn't helped by the fact that the new government was also finding its feet and wasn't really sure how to deal with this as well. And so we had some contradictory instructions or regulations from the Ministry of Higher Education.
Well, Thomas,
in regards to it, yeah.
Thomas, what do you think students want to hear from universities at this point in time? You talked about the confusion that at one point we thought this was going to be temporary, but it's a lot longer than anticipated. So students who are now at home thinking about the next semester, what do you think they want to hear from universities?
I mean, I think students like us want to get back into the classroom. I think we've realized that online teaching is a struggle for both students and staff. We had to adapt to it really quickly, and I think both staff and students are keen to get back in the classroom, get that face-to-face where it's much more personable and effective learning environment.
But surely, Thomas, even after the MCO is lifted, you're going to have the nature of learning and teaching in university is going to have to change. How is Nottingham University going to adapt to that?
So I think the online teaching may become a bigger part of the pedagogy or the delivery of content. It's not really clear yet how that will happen. But Nottingham, for example, has already begun to develop a tri-campus liberal arts program. So students would be taking liberal arts modules and degrees from 3 campuses and moving between campuses. We've had tri-campus online modules before in politics. We've done other kind of online forms of connection between the campuses. So in some ways, we've already started some of this kind of process, and we'll just have to see how much it becomes a part of life, I guess, after this period.
Yeah,
I'm keen to get back in the classroom.
Well, we're all going to have to make adjustments, long-term adjustments to the way we live, work and learn. Thomas, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight. That's all the time we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris with me, Sharad Kuttan, signing off for this evening. Thank you so much for watching and good night.